Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lockdown Dads. My name's Ian Dinwiddie. I'm the founder of Inspiring Dads, a coaching business that helps stressed dads balance work and fatherhood. I've got two children. I've got an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old.
And I'm James Miller, author of Dads Don't Babysit, editor of workingdads.co.uk, and also a father of two different children. And this week, well, we're back, aren't we? We're back for season 4. You know, the big difference is we've all had haircuts since season 3. That's a big difference. And we are delighted to kick off this episode with a special guest who is Simon Kettlewell, stay-at-home dad, author, and particularly pertinent for our purposes, author of this book, Eternity Leave, which I've written about on Working Dads and what various people have written about on various blogs. Thanks for joining us, Simon.
No, it's a pleasure. Good to be here.
We start with the same question. Might be a different season, but it's the same question that we start with because we are still in lockdown. We are still lockdown dads. So, you know, we can discuss to what extent we are maybe shortly. But it's the same simple question that has become actually quite a difficult question over the last year. How are you, Simon?
Well, I'm pretty well, actually. We've been very fortunate in lockdown. We live in a fairly rural area. It's just been very different. Now, I've got older children. Our eldest daughter is 22 now. And I've got twins who are 20, but they started university, 2 of them, the twins, and of course they've really missed their first year, spent a lot of time here, and that's been very nice in some ways, but their frustration, of course, has been huge. And we also have a 16-year-old son, well, he's 16 later this year, year 10 at school, so he was expected to do online learning, and anybody with a 15-year-old son will know just getting him to school is a difficult thing, but online learning, he did what he needed to do. But I'm very conscious that, you know, his mental health was the most important thing to me. I didn't really twig that for the first few weeks, and I think I probably needed him to carry on as he had been doing until it was actually one of my daughters who pointed out, look, you know, as long as he turns up, does what he's supposed to do. So just a changed world. My partner works for the NHS. It's one of the particularly true things in the book. And so she was gone for most of the time. So I was back to being a single dad, really, again.
I mean, this is not a criticism, but we've had this, comes up a lot in this podcast, but that's such a dad answer in some ways, because I asked how you are, and you've sort of answered it in relation to your family, to your kids and your partner and all the rest of it. And that's nice and that's fine, but it's a very sort of man-dad thing, isn't it? It's to sort of talk about what's going on around you and actually, you know, how have you coped with it? Because as you say, you've got a number of your family were working in the NHS. Obviously, you've got a teenage son you've got to try in school. That must have been, you know, no matter how pleasant your surrounding in your rural idyll, that must have tested your mental health as well.
Yeah, I think it did because, you know, you worry about your family and it's about you. We didn't know how long it was going to go on for. And obviously, we'd also got my daughters last summer worked in the hospital. They volunteered and then were employed as assistants. So we were exposed, obviously, to the risks of coronavirus. My mother is 94, so she had to shield. So there were a lot of things to think about. And, you know, trying to guide people, I always end up still being the responsible one, despite the fact that we have adults. So, yeah, I mean, mentally, I feel okay, but I'm conscious that I was very restricted to what I could do. I was suddenly back here with a bunch of adults, different behaviours altogether. They think they know everything, but of course, you know, you still have things to add. So it was stressful at times. It would be wrong to say that it wasn't. They'd had their freedom for a while, and suddenly everybody was brought back together. And that was quite tough. And I would be lying to say there weren't days when I was a pretty grumpy man, you know. And yeah, so I think mentally we all were challenged. But, you know, you can't say these things without recognizing how dreadful it has been for some people.
We'll come back to your grumpiness when we talk about the book very shortly, or otherwise. But let's just knock off the full round of how are yous. It's been, what, a month, Ian? How are you now?
Well, I'm hoping we're not going to round off with just me because we haven't done you, and we forgot you a couple of weeks ago, a couple of episodes ago. I'm pretty good. So I like the way you picked up Simon on thinking about other people, because you've done that to me before. So very consistent on that. Pretty good. Met my dad. We travelled to Stonehenge, which is both free for National Trust members and roughly halfway between Somerset and London. So we did Christmas presents. We pulled up 2 cars next to each other. And we exchanged Christmas presents through the boot. From my stuff for my dad, stuff for the kids, and a bit of a walk around the rocks, the stones, and that kind of thing. That was very nice. We had a barbecue. I caught the sun. Had a haircut. Feel great having a haircut. Yeah, it's been really nice. Oh, and I've dabbled in crypto trading and made some money. Whoa!
Whoa.
Don't take tips from me though.
No, this is not one of those podcasts, all right? We're not going that route of plugging cryptocurrencies and stuff. That's not.
I really wouldn't recommend it. It's quite scary.
About the idea. Did you have a barbecue at Stonehenge?
No, we had a barbecue. Different days.
That's not allowed, is it?
Yeah, but no, I think they probably frown upon you. We had one at home, and we had a family come and visit. Kids played in the garden. We sat outside. It was very normal, I think, the thing really, James. But yeah, and I caught the sun. It was like, oh, so yeah, it's feeling good. What about you, James? What have you been doing in the last month or so since we last saw each other?
Done, burnt the bald spot. That is bad. That's an age thing. Oh, it's rubbish. I have to start wearing a hat. I mean, maybe that might be a future tip on having. If you're old enough to have a bald spot, you should get a hat. And I noticed certainly, Simon sitting there just mocking me with his luxurious locks there. Just by hand. He doesn't have to wear a hat, but that might be a future tip. Yes, it's lovely, isn't it? Sun's out, normality's returning. I went somewhere else last week. It was amazing. I went somewhere else. I mean, it was Chester, which is like, it was all right. But just being somewhere else is restorative. I didn't realize how much I needed a break until I went somewhere else. So yeah, that was a massive boon to the old mental health and generally surviving. Because, we are, as I said at the start, we are still in lockdown. It is still weird. You're sitting talking about sharing Christmas presents from the boot in Stonehenge. Like, that's normal. I mean, that's weird, right? But we sort of go, well, that's nice, brilliant. I got to sit in the boot in Stonehenge. But yeah, it feels like things are on the up. So generally, all right. Kids back at school, yada, yada. We haven't got to worry about that anymore. That seems like a long time ago. Remember homeschool? All right. I think it sounds like we're all fairly cheery. So let's go back to talking about whether Simon's a grumpy man or not. Eternity Leave, a novel, not a memoir, but clearly massively influenced by your experiences as a stay-at-home dad, in which you sometimes paint yourself as a slightly grumpy man. I've said it before. I said it in the piece in Working Dads. It's shot through with a lot of affection in there, I think, which is nice. To what extent? Well, why did you write it in the first place? Let's start there.
Well, I wrote it because I was really finding it hard to get down to a story. I'd written pure novels before, and a few years ago, in fact, it was more than a few years ago. This is where you realise you're getting older because you think, oh, it's 2 years ago, and it wasn't. It was 10. So it might have been 10 years ago where I wrote a few columns for one of these Sunday local newspapers. It was Norfolk and Suffolk, Eastern Daily News, and they wanted to do a supplement like they did down here as well on a Sunday, and it just didn't work out. I did a couple of episodes, just columns, and it was really about a dad looking after kids, and it was a kind of wry, humorous, although at the time I had to reach really low, scratch the bottom of the barrel for the humour, because it wasn't funny, and then. And I just shoved them away, as you do. And I'd written quite a few in advance, and it didn't happen, as I say, the first couple. And I was looking, it had been about 3 years since I'd finished a novel. I'd started them, my agent particularly liked them. And I think actually I'd said to you, James, at some point, that my agent had described me as a mid-range author. And what she meant really by that was I had a book called The Truth About Us, which did pretty well, really, but it was a pure novel. And she said, look, if you carry on writing this sort of stuff, which does appeal to, a certain audience, you will be a bit mid-range. She said, I need you to put something in front of me that's that breakthrough book. And I'm not one of those people, because I think the way I've lived tends to follow the norm. I write because I want to write something that really inspires me, makes me think. And it was my daughter, or one of my daughters, who read one of the columns. I got stuff out on the paper. She said, well, why don't you just write what you've done? The mothers have done it, Why Mummy Drinks, the Unmumsy Mum. And I thought, no, it'll just be rubbish. It'll just be some anecdotal diary that nobody wants to read. And of course, then when you look at the mummy books, you think, ooh, they're anecdotal diaries that everybody wants to read. And so I cast around. There was none done by a bloke. I was really struggling to write a story that really captured me. And so I spoke to my agent. She really disliked the idea. And I thought, well, stop that. I'll write it anyway. And it was really easy to write. I really set out to do a couple of things. One was to capture younger children, parents of younger children, and also to write about what it was like as teenagers, because I really just needed a notebook to do that and walk around the house. And I thought, I'm going to have a go at it. And it just worked out well. My agent, when she first saw it, was very circumspect, but she helped me shape it into the book it is today. And I wrote it. It is a novel, but it's written as a memoir. There's an awful lot of true things in it. But, that's what novel writing is about. And it seemed to me that I'd learned the trick of writing novels. Why didn't I write the things that really mattered to me? And it ended up being an affectionate book, because I look back at, 20 years of bringing up the kids. It was a collective, but I did 90% of it. That's the reality. And that's how it came about, really. And when I'd finished it, I thought, yeah, this has got a wide audience appeal. But I was also interested in talking to people like yourself. I wanted to get something on the agenda, because I really did, and you probably see it in the book, struggle with a sense of isolation, which was because I didn't meet that many fathers at that time. It did increase a little bit, but it was still a very small number. So that's what prompted me to write it, really. And looking back, it was like a record. Most people, they have a little gong at the end of their career, a barometer or potting shed. And I just had people saying goodbye to me and saying, could you send me my monthly allowance? And then coming back, raiding the fridge and knackering the washing machine. And I thought, this is quite a good marker for what I did. So should I pass on? They've got that to read and remember.
Better than a shed, isn't it? Those kids
definitely
rather have 4 kids in a shed, right?
Yeah.
Simon, when it came to sort of tapping into those early memories, the ones that weren't quite so easy to tap it, weren't quite as easy as walking around with a notebook and observing and remembering sort of older children. What was the process for you? How did you go about kind of tapping into some of those younger bits? Because my wife always complains I forget everything from when the kids were little. I even one year I even forgot Struan had chicken pox. A year later I'd forgotten, even though I was the one looking after him. So I'm notorious for that kind of. No, James laughing at me. I'm notorious for that. But how did you do it? What was the process like for you?
Well, writing a novel, people do it differently, but I wrote it in a very linear way, and because it was chronological, I really did just spend time thinking about what we'd done. And for the first few months, it was a series of horrors, really. And I think in the book I say, this guy suddenly is handed this child, and there were 6 months of maternity leave, 6 months of unparalleled joy of 2 parents, 1 small child. It was easy. And then there was that day, which came inevitably. I was totally unprepared for it, in the same way as, you might conceive a child, but 9 months later, the child appears and the mother has got all that time preparing herself mentally and physically. And the day just arrived, as far as I was concerned. And so I as I went along, I picked things that really struck a chord with me. So the surprise of suddenly one day not having a child, and then suddenly having a child, and beginning to watch this child and realize that I was going to be the sole carer, and I knew nothing about childcare. I can't even say I particularly liked children up until that point. I kind of liked my wife, and I thought, well, maybe we might produce a reasonably nice child, but that's not how it works, of course, is it? And so I looked at specific incidents that really resonated. So you're absolutely right, Ian. I think I would forget things. In fact, the kids will remind me, say, that's just simply not what happened. But the things I did remember, I think, was probably because they were particularly either painful or I learned a huge amount from those occasions. And I probably could pick almost every scenario in the book and say, yeah, actually, the early years, the things I remembered. The later years were things that resonated with me afterwards. When I look back, I thought, oh, yeah, that's really quite an important thing that happened. And then I was able to distill the other things that I wanted to say in the book, which was about, isolation, loss of self-esteem, the gender default that, we still have this thing that without a conversation, the women will end up looking after the children. So that's how I did it, really.
So why did you end up looking after the children? I mean, that's the obvious question. Given that you didn't even necessarily like children, was it purely chance that it just fell to you, sort of thing?
No, it wasn't chance. Actually, I worked in the NHS, and I met my wife through the NHS. And sometimes you meet people at work, and you realise they're actually better at it than you are. And so I did very well for a couple of years while she was in my department. I ran a community trust, or a large chunk of one, and she came to manage mental health services. And then when you see somebody that's so able, I thought, yeah, she's going to go on and have a better career. And I left the NHS. I'd had enough of it, really. I'd done 20 years. It takes certain kinds of people increasingly that are good at the strategic interface and the politics. And I was done, really, with it. I'd done the various things that I wanted to do. So I went to work in Eastern Europe, which was in Romania, which was 9 years post the fall of communism. And it was a pretty harrowing experience. I worked with and in some psychiatric hospitals, trying to get them to think about how they might manage their services. But it was a human rights issue. All the women were dumped in these locked wards. Some of them they claimed they were over 16, but some of them certainly weren't. And the medication they gave to them was just extraordinary. And things have changed significantly through the years. I came back and I thought, well, I'm going to take a bit of a career break. I'd still got offers to go back into the NHS. I gathered a lot of skills. I thought, well, a couple of years, I'll renovate a house. And this is the bit that's true in the book. I'll renovate a house. I will grow a few vegetables. I'll become a man of the earth, which if you knew me well, you'd realize that was just ridiculous. And I'll write a novel. That was the other thing. I was going to sit and knock a novel out, and the literary word was simply, just be bowled over, and that would be it. My wife got pregnant, and I still didn't want to go back to the NHS. She'd just got promoted. We were living in Norfolk at the time. So we said, let's give this a try. And then within a year or so, she was headhunted to come down to the Southwest, and she got pregnant with twins. So we had 3 children, very close together. And I thought, well, no, I can do this. I've worked with one child, and we were, it was okay. I learned a lot along the way. But 3 children under the age of 2, should be an Olympic sport, really. And that's how I got into it, really. And I think I never hated it enough to want to get back out. I didn't want to go back to an office. I didn't want to go back to health service. Private industry was something I just wasn't interested in. We were very much public service people. So when we came down here, I thought, right, I'm going to pursue my idea of novel writing, which again was still a joke. I just didn't realise. But I did press on with it. I did write intermittently and sort of learn how to do it. I grew veg, and again in the book, I got poultry, and most of them died fairly quickly. And that's how I got into it by default. And I think my partner, either of us could have done it. There was no issue that, my partner didn't want to do it, or I specifically wanted. We just found actually at that time it was the right thing to do. So did I fall into it? Not initially. Initially I said, yeah, I'll have a go at this. I think I began to get stuck in it. As the cogs turned faster and faster, there were more cogs. I couldn't really see an obvious way to get out of it. And I tend to be one of those people that is a bit of a problem. I'm stupid enough to put my hand up and say, look, I'll throw my hat in, never necessarily realizing it would last for 20 years. But it did,
I'm fascinated by your phrasing there, that your wife got pregnant. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I don't know.
Twice she got pregnant. Pregnant.
Extraordinary.
Yes, there's some good bits in the book about. There's lots of good bits in the book, obviously, but the bits about trying to start a small holding are entertaining, shall we say? Probably not if you were actually living it, but they're entertaining to read about. One of the interesting moments in the book, if you like, is. Perhaps not in the book, but in your path, is where you say you stopped treating it as if you'd fallen into it and started taking it a bit more seriously. That's an interesting point where you suddenly realize that being a parent, being a stay-at-home dad is a serious job, and treating it as a job, and then you begin to get better at it. And I just think there's something interesting there, isn't there, for all men about treating parenthood and fatherhood seriously.
I do really. The mistake I made earlier on was, first of all, underestimating the workload. Just one child, two children, with a third child. And twins are funny to look after. They're quite unusual. And ours are non-identical. So they both had very individual characters. And allowing them to express themselves in individuals was something I thought, actually, I'm just lumping them in. I'm doing bulk catering here. And so while I was novel writing, and I didn't do anything well, that's the reality. I wasn't doing the novel writing. I certainly wasn't growing quality veg. It was better to go to Tesco's. I thought, I'm not doing any of these things well. And I just felt that I was kind of going into a bit of a black hole. And we were caught. We had 3 children. A fourth one came 5 years later. So that, they were quite connected in terms of the timescale. And I just realized that the thing that I was doing most of the time, I was also being compromised by the things I was trying to do, because I wanted to be able to talk to people at parties. I didn't realize that the best thing to do was not to go to the parties in the first place. So I was just asking for trouble. So I decided, I realized, and I couldn't tell you the trigger moment, but with children, you look at them when they're very little, they don't choose to be where they live. They don't choose to be in the environment. And I thought, actually, I'm depriving them if I don't do my absolute best. And I think, I was probably doing okay, but I really then began to plan my days. I really tried to get out with them all the time and discovered that was better to do. Actually, 3 children under 2 outside is actually less chaotic than 3 children inside. And so I began to learn. I watched other people, thought, well, I could do that. And I learned to multitask. That was the other thing. I recognized that suddenly I was instinctively doing several things at the same time. And that's what happened. And the novel writing then really went on hold, probably right up until about 2010, when I began again after my son started school. Because it wasn't important to me. It wasn't, and it still isn't the most important thing. And I think that's probably when I began to sell a few books, really.
I guess because it was much more natural, and you're doing it because you wanted to, and you had time and you could focus. I suppose. But it's the focus as well, isn't it, Simon? I suppose that I remember when my son went to school, youngest, and then that opened up all sorts of possibilities of sort of daily routines and activity. One thing I wanted to pick up on, you sort of talked about identity and the isolation in the book, and identity sort of, and the difficulty of going to parties and talking to people and saying what you did effectively. What kind of thoughts have you got about if you were to talk to yourself or to a man sort of starting the journey in the same sort of place? What kind of tips would you have for someone who, a man and a dad who's grasping, trying to grasp that identity and isolation? What sort of things you reflecting? What would you suggest to them?
Well, there's a few things. Obviously, I started it 20 years ago when the world was very different. And in fact, the internet had only just come on. Certainly, if I was giving advice now, I would say to any father, find other fathers, even if it's in cyber world. People like yourself, people are talking about it. John Adams, he and I have had a lot of conversations recently. He's done a couple of things and some articles, but it was more the conversation about the fact that he understood what I was talking about and vice versa. And some of the things, what he was doing in terms of his work. But going back through the years, I would say that before you then going to do it full time with 3 children, you don't have any hands free at all. And I think it's quite important to be able to make space. I chose impossible things with 3 children under the age of 2. I chose to try and do small holding and write novels. I probably couldn't have chosen 2 harder things to do. I should have joined groups. I should have joined groups with grown-ups in them that did different things to childcare. The only groups I ended up going to were nursery groups and play groups. Good and bad experiences, because I didn't meet many men. I know there's a couple of cliches in the book, but I just didn't meet a lot of men. I know there are far more involved now, but I still have connections with quite a lot of the mothers locally, and it's still a minority that go. And I was a bit hesitant to go to the preschools as well, and I think you just have to go in and get on with it, and just accept that what you do is just the same as all the women. It's hard. And I think acknowledging that it's hard and that actually you've got to break the mold a bit. But it's interesting, after all these years, I had several women, mothers that I spoke to when I was writing the book, to make sure I got a reasonably balanced view. And I should have talked to them years ago, because they said to me, look, actually what you did, we thought was great. You know, we thought it was a great example for what men can do. And we always thought, well, actually look at our husbands and think, well, if he can do it, so can I. And I thought, wow, that's, you know, if I'd known that before, that I probably was setting a bit of a good example. So my advice would be to try and be proud of what you're doing, because it is hard work. But today, join things. You know, there's so much around, so much information. And just looking at your working dad sites and things like that, it makes you feel as if you're part of a community. But certainly the joining of things outside childcare is really, really important. Even if it's learning a language, learning to use a potter's wheel or whatever, that's really important. I ride a motorbike, and for a few years now, I've been part of a group, not Hells Angels group. They wouldn't have me. But that's been great, because it's something totally devoid of children. But I wish I'd done it years ago, but I didn't. I actually, 5 years ago, I bought a new bike, and it was only accidentally I met someone in the pub, and he said, "Oh, why did you come along?" And it's great. It's refreshing. I come back and smell of oil and
manly stuff.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's quite important as well. Loads of stuff. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah,
definitely.
This thing we come back to time and again on this, isn't it? Is looking after yourself. So you're no use to anybody else if you're not looking after yourself. And if that involves going off and playing on motorbikes or whatever it might involve, it's very important to, again, it comes back to what we mentioned at the beginning. You start as a man, as a dad, you think about the people around you, perhaps, and you need to actually look after yourself. Because you mentioned cliches in the book, and actually there's not many. I mean, there's some, but then there's a reason for cliches, is because they're true. But there's surprisingly few, I would suggest, because it'd be very easy to write a book about bumbling dad, so on and so forth. But one of the strengths of the book is that the dad in it, who may or may not be very closely related to you, is multidimensional. So as I said, he's a bit grumpy sometimes, because sometimes parenting makes you grumpy. He makes mistakes, but he also clearly cares for his family, puts them first, is clearly in awe of his partner quite a lot of the time. He's a multi-dimensional character. And you mentioned at the beginning this sort of trend for books like Why Mummy Drinks, etc., which tend to have characters which are less multidimensional, I would suggest. And I just wonder what it all means, if you like, where in terms of what it means to be a parent and what it means in terms of role models for parents, that there is this trend towards perhaps one-dimensional parents who are, struggling / laughing at themselves and so on, when there's a bit more to it than that, isn't it?
Oh, there's a great deal more to it. And I have to be a bit careful about the mummy books, because I've been asked to do the first opening session at the Exeter Literary Festival with Sarah Turner, the Unmumsy Mum. We've had a brief chat, but of course we come at it from quite interesting angles, because she talks about, and hers is a bit more of a manual, in a way, a manual for life with young children. But the husband plays a bit of a walk-on part in it. And if I remember correctly, it's called Simon. Whereas mine, goes straight in. I like to think that, it doesn't paint the main character as an extremely confident person, but not hopeless either. And I think that the balance has got to be that actually men and women can do it equally well, some better than others. If I'm in a supermarket and a child cries, my instinct now is so honed that I will immediately turn. But I'll see other men and it just won't, it's not my department, sort of thing. And that's a phrase I hear a lot. I was asked this question a while back about how I thought that the gender debate could be tackled. And I genuinely believe, there's two camps. We've got the mummy books and we've got the book that I've written. The crossover, and I think it will be interesting, because my immediate sort of feelings about the conversation that I'm going to be doing is that there might be a bit, not conflict, but not an easy juxtaposition of the two. And I think, getting men and women collectively, because having the conversation about who's going to look after the kids at some point, even if it's somewhere down the line, it can be quite a heated conversation, needs to happen. Because I know a lot of women who the conversation never took place. They just ended up looking after the children. It's a bit like being cremated or buried. the relatives, they won't have I'm talking about the undertakers will say, please have the conversation before the person dies, because it causes the greatest problems. I just happen to know an undertaker, and he says that. And I think this conversation about who's looking after the children before it happens is utterly vital. And knowing what you can expect from one another.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about that communication, and we had Jessica Chivers on talking about the Dad B1 form, which is an interesting idea that you get men to think about what they're going to do in terms of care before the baby actually arrives. When is this Exeter Literary Festival event? Because I want to watch this.
Mine's on November the 5th. I mean, we might actually be able to firework night. So, I mean, that's a fascinating sort of coincidence. But November the 5th, I assume it will be streamed, but I can let you know. And whether we'll be actually be able to go in person, I have a hunch we might. Who knows?
Well, before November the 5th, do you know where this is going, Ian? Do you know what I'm going to recommend?
No, I don't know. I never know with your recommendations. I can never.
Previous recommendation on this podcast conflicted by Ian Leslie on how to disagree productively. That sounds like a perfect example for how to have a disagreement that is actually both respectful but also productive, because I suspect there will be some disagreement there. We need to crack on with the recommendations, don't we? So I'll tell you what, I'll pitch mine first, because it sort of ties into something that Simon said there about his biker mates. Is that okay to call them bikers? Is that
yes.
It's The Falcon and the Winter Soldier on Disney Plus, which is actually not very good, and it's not the first time I've recommended something that's not actually very good. But it's about two men, and it's about all sorts of, it's obviously about superheroes and fighting and stuff, but it's a story about two men and their sort of reluctance to admit that they're friends, and they're coming to terms with their common experiences. The actual story is not great, but if you focus on that, it's quite interesting, I think. So on that basis alone, I will recommend The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which finishes today. I think the last one goes out Disney Plus today. Where should we go next? Ian, you got a recommendation?
Well, I mean, I had two recommendations. My original recommendation was to buy cryptocurrency before it goes up, not before it goes down. But it got superseded. Lunchtime, Friday, trying to get things sorted out. Lunchtime, sat outside in the garden, just shut my eyes, let the sun hit my face, just listen to the birds, and just that 10, 15 minutes of actually doing nothing, not scrolling through my phone, just closed my eyes and enjoyed the sun, fresh air and the sun, just a little reset, a little bit of well-being stuff. So I think that's really my tip.
Meditation, that's a good one. There's also the latest Adam Buxton podcast where he interviews Lee Mack, right? Gagmeister. But he talks all about meditation and exactly that, sitting in the garden, 25 minutes, sitting still and all that sort of stuff. It's quite interesting. So I'll add that as a bonus recommendation. Go and listen to that, and then you can do what Ian's been doing. Simon, have you got a recommendation to fathers everywhere?
Well, my recommendation would be is, first of all, assume you can do it. You can look after your kids. And the recommendation would be is that if you do put the time in, you will get it back in one form or another, and worth just giving that some time about what you do with your children now, whether it's lip service or whether it's something that you feel is an investment for the future.
That is a good recommendation. I like that as a good start to the series.
Thanks. Better than mine.
No, I think yours is good as well. I think that's a good set of recommendations, but particularly
definitely
put the time in and you'll get it back. I think that's very, very valuable.
Yeah, I think it's very easy. I mean, it's just sometimes it's just about, I think it's just about carving that little bits of time out and just focusing entirely on your children and actually talking to them and spending time and not being, and it's not just as an aside to something else that you're doing. I think anything like that. That's, maybe a bit of growing of vegetables as well. That's probably quite a good family activity as well, Simon.
Not for me anymore.
No,
I'm not time with veg.
Fantastic. Simon, where can people go to learn more about what you do, more about your blogging, and where can they go to find out about your book?
Well, they can find me at my website, which is simonkettlewell.co.uk, and I've done quite a few blogs. I'm about to know another one around the book, but on childcare, role models, and self-esteem, quite a few things on that. I'm on Twitter at Simon Kettlewell, so you can find me on those. And I'm always really keen to talk to people. I've got quite a lot of people have a book for reviews and things now because they've asked whether they can do reviews. So if they come through my website, I will get back to people because, you know, I'm really keen, not just about being, you know, having written a book and getting it out there, but talking about this debate, because I like to think over 20 years I've learned a bit. You know, I don't think that I'm an expert, but I feel that I'd really like to add to the debate and to see if we can take it a little bit further. The book is available just on Amazon at the moment because of lockdown. The bookshops are all closed. And there's a discussion at the moment about whether the paperback will come out in the next couple of months or whatever. But it can always be ordered through bookshops, and it can go. If people don't like Amazon, it can be available on Waterstones and Barnes and Noble for their websites. But Amazon's usually got a deal or two every so often, so that's worth looking out for.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put those links in the comments associated with it, whether you're watching on YouTube or on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us, Simon, and thank you very much for the listeners and the watchers for joining us this week for episode number 40 of Lockdown Dads. We're back. We're recording next week. We're actually going to release in a couple of weeks' time. So we will be back for episode 41 in 2 weeks' time. So we look forward to you joining us then. So in the meantime, do subscribe, give it a like, get in touch with us if you've enjoyed the content. But that's thank you very much from me, Ian, and thank you for Simon for joining us, and thank you, James, for interesting and important conversation about dads. And I think it's one that should resonate with people throughout the ages. Thank you very much, everyone.